US President Donald Trump addressed the World Economic Forum in Davos, speaking by video link from the White House. And Trump had several clear messages for business leaders who were gathered at the Swiss ski resort for their annual global summit. He harshly criticised allies Canada and the European Union. He demanded that OPEC lower oil prices, and he called for lower global interest rates. The US president also promised the global business elite lower taxes if they invest in the US, and he threatened tariffs if they don't.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay down debt.
DW correspondent Ben Fajzullin is in Davos following the World Economic Forum for us, and he told us more about reactions there to Trump's address.
Mr. Trump has managed to cast a long shadow over the World Economic Forum here in Davos without even being here. He did join the forum digitally, and he did make it very clear that he would be the one driving the global agenda. Companies like to hear things like lower taxes, more investment and less regulation, but they do not want a trade war, and that looks likely under Trump's tariffs. His top-down approach to the economy could also backfire. He wants to see lower global oil prices. Past presidents have tried demanding that, but their demands have fallen on deaf ears. He wants lower interest rates as well, but a president shouldn't be meddling in that part of a modern-day market economy. As far as diversity goes, studies here have shown that it drives productivity in companies, but Trump would like to see less of it. He'd also like to see more oil, gas and coal and less renewables at a time that renewables have become cheaper in generating electricity over fossil fuels. So a lot of frustration across the board here with all the attention on Mr. Trump and less attention on other causes, especially in the social space. As far as things like child labour goes, it's never made it onto the agenda here at the World Economic Forum. And activists tell me time and again they're trying to clean up supply chains and root out things like child labour. But the World Economic Forum has so many challenges ahead. It's trying to make the world a better place. Will it, though? Will AI drive equality or inequality? There, Mr. Trump has promised huge investments in infrastructure. But what about the guardrails?
That was Ben Fajzullin reporting from Davos. Now, addressing the World Economic Forum, Donald Trump also confirmed that he is pulling the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement and that he will invest more in the fossil fuels that drive global warming. In just a moment, we'll ask DW's chief climate reporter what the withdrawal could mean for the rest of the planet. But first, let's take a look at this report.
But I'm immediately withdrawing from the unfair, one-sided Paris Climate Accord ripoff.
Donald Trump does not believe the science that climate change is driven by greenhouse gases. He calls it a scam. On day one of his administration, he signed an executive order to take the US out of the Paris Agreement. The US now joins a tiny handful of nations, including Iran and Yemen, that are not part of the accord. Signatories to the Paris deal commit voluntarily to reducing their CO2 emissions, with the aim of avoiding the worst effects of the climate crisis. Richer nations also help developing nations to transition and to adapt to climate change. The 2015 deal was seen as a breakthrough because it's truly global. But Trump says it unfairly burdens American taxpayers. There's no doubt that the US withdrawal is a blow for the fight to limit global warming. But that's not all. Trump has made drilling for more oil and gas a priority. Biden-era protections against drilling in Alaska have also been lifted. Fossil fuels are the biggest driver of climate change. The US has historically emitted the most CO2 worldwide. Its emissions have dropped in recent years, but it's still the second highest emitter behind China, accounting for nearly 13% of global emissions. Trump is also rolling back Biden-era legislation requiring the auto industry to make cars more fuel efficient, and legislation promoting the sale of electric vehicles. Joe Biden oversaw massive investment in clean energy, with global effect. The world's largest economy is influential. It's a major shareholder in the World Bank, for example. It and other multilateral banks have invested massively in renewable energy projects over the last 4 years. That could now change. The Trump administration's policy reversal sends a very different signal to the markets, and other governments too. Trump has pledged to put America first. But even recent disasters like last year's Hurricane Helene, which caused catastrophic damage in 6 US states, and the ongoing California fires, which are already the most destructive the region has ever seen, show climate change is real and dangerous in the US too, even if the president doesn't believe it.
And for more, joining me now in the studio is DW's chief climate reporter, Louise Osborne, who might have some of the answers to all of these questions that we have. Let's talk first of all, Louise, about the international reaction to Trump essentially rolling back American climate policies.
I mean, I don't think anyone was surprised. This is something that Trump has been talking about in his election campaigning. And obviously, it's something that he's done before in his first term as president. So everybody was expecting this to happen. Regardless, China said that it was concerned about this movement, that, climate change is something that affects all of humanity, and all of humanity should be working to try to deal with those impacts. Quite big words, considering China is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. The least developed countries, which includes countries like Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, those kinds of countries, said that they were concerned that there would be a reverse of, hard-won kind of gains when it comes to climate. And then you had the EU doubling down on its commitment to try to move forward with green energy and things. Mm-hmm. But I think some of the interesting points came from analysts who basically said that the US is shooting itself in the foot by doing this. Not only does it lose any political advantage it has in negotiations, in trying to shape the way that the world deals with greenhouse gas emissions and trying to reduce those, but economically speaking, the world is moving towards renewables, and this is a step back for the US, who will then be concentrating on technologies that are not the innovations that we're going to be seeing from other countries like China, for example.
That's right, and there is an inherent momentum, isn't there, in terms of renewable energy and that kind of thing that will just keep moving forward. However, America is a huge emitter. It's pulled itself out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So what does this mean for global efforts, to keep global temperatures down?
I mean, obviously, it is a step back. We're talking about more than 10% of greenhouse gas emissions that are represented by the US at the moment. It is also the biggest historic emitter, so some people would say that it has a responsibility to try to reduce its emissions more quickly. It does mean scientists have also said that already we are, meeting a lot of challenges when it comes to trying to reduce emissions and reduce temperatures to under 1.5, to keep it below 1.5. That is going to be more difficult, no question. But there are US states that are stepping forward and saying that they are committed to trying to keep emissions or to reduce emissions regardless of what the president is saying. And there are also, we're talking about 10% of emissions. It's not nothing. Obviously, it is huge. But there are still around 90% of emissions that are represented by the Paris Agreement and by countries that are still committed to move in the direction to reduce.
All right. We are running out of time, Louise, but presumably that means that other countries are going to have to compensate, aren't they? They're going to have to step up their efforts. And
we have the COP30 conference on climate taking place at the end of the year. Countries are already putting forward their commitments for that. They are going to have to show more strength in moving towards reducing their emissions and adapting to climate change, and also looking at investing in green energy.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. DW's chief climate reporter, Louise Osborne. Thank you so much, Louise.
Let's get some context from Bill Hare. He's worked on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement in 2015. And he's also the founder and CEO of a non-profit climate analytics. He joins us now from Perth in Australia. Great to have you on the program, Bill. President Trump has ordered the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement. Is it now dead?
Good morning. Look, it's definitely not dead. The Paris Agreement's quite resilient. Remember, this is the second time that Trump has withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement, and the first time, I think it's fair to say, we hardly noticed. Now, obviously, this time it's going to be more damaging. It's definitely going to be a major setback for at least the morale on climate policy globally. But if you think about the real issues going on in the economy, things have fundamentally changed in the last 8 years. Right now, renewable energy, clean tech investment is way ahead of fossil fuel investment. It's a lot, renewables are a lot cheaper than they were 8 years ago when Trump first withdrew US from the agreement. So the bottom line is that this is going to cause a major problem, I believe, for the clean tech industry in the US. There could be $50 to $80 billion of lost economic opportunities for the United States. And other countries are now in a position to step up and take over those market opportunities. So, yeah, it's a pretty bad move on the climate change, particularly to have the president of the world's largest emitter, the United States, as a climate denialist. But the fact is, as your correspondents have pointed out, the US is suffering extremely badly from climate change. The shocking fires in Los Angeles, Hurricane Helene last year, just the latest example. So I don't think Trump will be able to hide from these problems ultimately.
You're talking about the largest emitter on the planet, but that emitter will now emit more, right? Because Donald Trump is pushing for increased fossil fuel production, and he's also backing the combustion engine-driven car industry. Surely that can't be good for the planet.
It's absolutely not. It's really not good at all. It's quite bad. But when you sit down and work out the numbers, it's a significant setback for climate action. It's going to make it harder to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but it's not a catastrophe. We're likely to see maybe 2 to 4 billion additional tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions because of the Trump actions over the next 4 to 5 years. But we should be able to recover that, providing other countries keep moving forward. Trump is making a very big push on fossil fuels, but he's doing so in a market that is already oversupplied with fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency has been talking about a glut, an oversupply of natural gas and oil, lower prices and so on. So it could turn out to be a Pyrrhic move, expanding oil and gas when there's no real market for it.
You said a while back that renewables are getting a lot cheaper, but despite that, developing a sustainable green economy is generally proving a challenge across the world, particularly in the developing world. Is there any way of making the transition to greener fuels easier and potentially more profitable?
It's a good question. You know, the best way to do this is to keep building up clean tech. By that I mean renewable energy, electric vehicles, highly efficient industries in the richer and larger economies, because that is going to create the cheaper technologies that can be then deployed in developing countries. I mean, right now, for example, China is selling a lot of its clean tech into the developing world. I know there's a lot of concern in Europe about Chinese clean tech, including electric vehicles, causing problems for the car market in Europe. But China is taking advantage of the move towards clean tech in many other countries. So I think that kind of momentum is a major opportunity. Also for the European Union. The European Union now is going to move forward with these green industries and so on, and that's the correct thing to do. And the big loser out of all this is likely to be the United States, not the rest of us.
One final question, Bill. There is a lot of skepticism around climate change around the world. How do you think the scientific community can help raise awareness around climate change?
It's an interesting question. If you look at the public opinion polls, there is a high level of awareness right around the world of climate change. I think what people are concerned about is whether policies are really working. So I think scientists and policymakers need to keep communicating the benefits of climate action and how they're going to deliver real world improvements to people's lives. I think that's one of the challenges. I mean, right now we've got the world's hottest year behind us, 2024, probably the warmest year since the end of the last interglacial 125,000 years ago. Extraordinary temperatures. People everywhere are feeling the pain from that, whether it's extreme heat, wildfires, floods, lethal heat events in Asia. People are really, really aware of climate change now, and the demands are increasing on governments everywhere for action, including in places which are not the most democratic. I was in China last year for a few weeks and heard a lot of calls from people there for more action from government. So I think that's something that governments everywhere are going to have to rise to. And I think the big challenge now is whether industry will stay the course. We heard from your reporter, Ben, from Davos, that industry, I think his word is kowtowing to Trump. Well, let's hope that doesn't really happen, because we don't need industry to go backwards on this. We need industry to go forward and take advantage of the clean opportunities.
We'll leave it there for the moment, but thanks so much for joining us today. Climate expert and CEO of nonprofit Climate Analytics, Bill Hare. Thanks so much.
And we can get more on this with Robin Lamboll from Imperial College London. Welcome to DW, Robin. So with President Trump now withdrawing the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, can you tell us where this leaves global efforts to reduce emissions?
Yes, it's unfortunate and this has happened, and it is very sad because, of course, you can't solve climate change with one country going on its own. It can't hive itself off. You can't have individual countries all trying to put themselves first. That ends up with everyone losing. However, what we can say is that, firstly, it is better for America to be out of the Paris Agreement altogether than for it to be inside but trying to gum up the transition to renewable energy in the way that we've seen Saudi Arabia doing in the last COP agreement. This way, at least, it's not directly involved as strongly as it would be. The other thing to say is that it's not really clear that the president has that much power over how much drilling happens in America. On the whole, drilling is limited by the price of fossil fuels rather than by the availability of places to drill in America at the moment.
But presumably he's going to make drilling easier. I mean, he says, doesn't he, that he wants to put America first by backing fossil fuels. I mean, does this make business sense for America?
No, we've got a situation at the moment where America has more jobs and is putting more investment into renewable energy than it is into fossil fuels at the moment. It is the leading exporter of fossil fuels across the world. It's the leading producer. However, that isn't the thing that in the future is going to be making the most money. At the moment, his actions are trying to push down fossil fuel prices at a time when other countries in the world are trying to push them up and are reducing their production capacity. So it's not really clear that this makes very much economic sense either.
A sustainable green economy, developing a green economy, of course, does take time, though, doesn't it? So could you give us some examples of how this transition can happen faster, how it can be profitable?
Yeah, so the problems that we're encountering at the moment are not just in terms of producing the renewable energy. We've seen with the Inflation Reduction Act, which started pumping money into America producing more renewable energy forms than we have had in the past, that this transition has been boosting jobs, has been boosting the American production of American-grown energy that is sustainable, that is a long-term good investment. And more of that so far has not been unwound, but there is obviously the real risk that Trump will continue this and will also start unwinding the financial good investments that America has started making recently, risking jobs, risking the green transition. But at the moment, that has actually gone quite well. So more of that would be a good thing to see other countries taking this opportunity now that maybe America is not going to be the powerhouse of renewable energy production that it has been trying to reshape itself into over the last few years. If other countries can seize this opportunity to start producing not just the renewable energy infrastructure itself, but the grid connectivity and the energy storage, that we need to support that. which provides a much better spread of jobs across the world rather than just in the regions that have available fossil fuels.
So other countries need to step up now. There's obviously opportunities to be exploited. There is still the fact, though, isn't there, that lots of people still don't believe in climate change. They don't understand it. What can the scientific community do to change people's minds?
Yeah, the truth of the matter is that scientists have already said what we need to say, and it's now the job of ordinary people in the community to talk to those around them, to share the experience they've had, because climate change is no longer something on a graph. It's something you can see looking out the window at the unprecedented floods, at the unprecedented storms that we're seeing across the world now. So it's really more for people in the community to talk to those around them, to tell them about this. And if they have questions about how we know it's not a natural cycle, how we know it's not just the sun or something like that, then they can come to us and we can explain the flaws that maybe people misunderstand about these things. But at the moment, it's really something where you can just look at the average temperature of the region where you live in, and you can directly see that scientists' predictions, decade on decade, have simply been correct.
Robin Lamboll from Imperial College London. Robin, thank you so much for your time today and for your insights. We appreciate it. And I'm joined now by my colleague from DW Business, Kassandra Sundt, to talk more about President Trump's plans. Good to see you, Kassandra. So, first of all, what did Trump's executive order say exactly?
So even as Trump was signing an executive order pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, he was signing other executive orders talking about how the United States is going to really invest in this fossil fuel future. So one of them, in all caps, was called Unleashing American Energy. And here we're really talking about maximizing what the Trump administration calls the U.S.'s natural resources. But what we're not talking about here is solar and wind. We are definitely talking about fossil fuels. And in this order, he's talking about encouraging energy exploration and production on federal lands and waters. The order also calls for the elimination of the electric vehicle mandate and encourages more production and processing of non-fuel minerals, which includes things like rare earth minerals, for example. But there was another executive order, which was also signed on Inauguration Day from the president, in which he declares a national energy emergency in the United States, which had a lot of the same language about increasing production and fossil fuel supply, but it also identified strengthening energy infrastructure, which sounds pretty good, but there's really not so many mentions of strengthening the grid, for example. However, there are specific mentions about clearing away hurdles for oil refining infrastructure in that order.
OK, so we're talking drill, baby, drill, and rolling back everything that President Biden tried to do in the last 4 years. OK, so the aim of all of this is to increase fossil fuel production. That's its focus. Is that what's now going to happen? Is it as easy as that?
It's not as easy as this. Really, it's talking about laying the groundwork to make things easier, but the companies are going to have to take up the administration on this. So the EO really tries to cut away red tape for fossil fuel energy producers, but this isn't guaranteed that they will drill. If you just have an economics, like 101 perspective, yeah, okay, more oil means cheaper prices, but just because it's more attractive, it doesn't mean that these companies will actually drill. So there's some skepticism here because it's just not a one-to-one equation. But the U.S., something that Trump alludes to, and it's hard for me to understand how he keeps both of these thoughts in his brain, but the U.S. is already the world's top oil producer. The U.S. has a lot of oil, but oil is a global market. So we're going to have to see how this plays out. But I do want to give credit where credit is due. Looking at two major indicators of oil prices, Brent crude and West Texas Intermediate, by the end of this week, they're forecasted to be down on the week. By my last look, it was 3% for Brent crude and 4% down for West Texas Intermediate. OK, now you said, Kassandra, that oil obviously operates on a global market. That means it's not just the US president who is setting policy. I mean, there are other people, other countries, other leaders who get to have a say and have influence. Exactly. Drill, baby, drill sounds really good to consumers who are maybe feeling like they see really high energy prices or gasoline prices in the United States. But there are at least, and I'm really simplifying here, but there are at least two big interest groups here. One is going to be producers in other countries, OPEC, for example. They could choose, while the U.S. ramps up energy production to ramp down their production. So that's not a simple one-to-one equation. But Trump, he did speak to the crown Saudi prince, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, earlier this week. And I won't do my Trump impression, but he said that you got to bring oil prices down. He also said that that would help end the war in Ukraine. Maybe it's some icing on the cake for him. But Saudi Arabia is a top exporter of oil around the world and a leading member of OPEC, so they have a lot of influence. A second interest group here, almost ironically, is oil producers in the United States. Just because it's easier to produce oil doesn't mean they automatically will, because they want to get the best price for what they have on offer. And something to remember about fossil fuels is that they operate obviously quite differently than, say, solar or wind, which in most cases has to be used basically immediately. But oil in the ground is oil you can basically burn at a later time. So they're going to do what's best for their bottom line. And just because it's more attractive, from a U.S. regulatory perspective, doesn't mean it's best for these companies' bottom lines and their obligations to their shareholders.
DW's Kassandra Sundt, thanks so much for clarifying a lot of that for us. Kassandra, thank you.